Hi. I think we're recording. So, got my microphone. Hopefully, you can hear me. Somebody said that the previous lecture was a little bit hard to hear. So, I actually did that one um, on a different computer. So, I'm back at the office today. What I'm going to do today is an experiment. I'm going to try to use this thing called the whiteboard, and I'm going to do some drawing for you. I'm going to try to draw um, some pictures of relationality. So, the name of this lecture is Relationality, and we're going to be talking about the Paul Riesman article, which is very long. And I'm just going to really hit a couple of highlights. Um, the main thing I want you to take away from this article is that there has been a lot of ethnography. Remember, ethnography is when an anthropologist is creating a text that tries to capture some unique concept of a culture. And there's been a lot of ethnography over the last 100 years or so that um, talks about the concept of personhood and also the concept of relationality or the idea of connectedness that we find really central to many African cultures. You know what, if not all African cultures, all of them that I know of anyway, have a different concept of connectedness than what we experience in the Western world, where our primary way of thinking about ourselves is as individuals, with bounded edges and corners and boundaries and concepts like privacy and concepts like self autonomy and concepts like self reliance. These concepts that we experience in Western culture are important. They're part of who we are, but they're also kind of uniquely our culture. And that's the whole nature of the beast. Uh, Everybody's culture has unique features, and that's what we're here to talk about. So, uh, one of the things I want to start with is talking a little bit about the concept that I know I mentioned in the previous lecture that is about birth order and also the idea about polygyny. So, what does this look like? And sometimes I think it's helpful to actually talk through a family, have somebody very concrete in mind. So, let's imagine that this is a man and his name is going to be, oh, I don't know, Bill. Um, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this very well. Nah, that that is going to be that's going to be too annoying if I try to write people's names. Let's just imagine this guy's name is Bill. He's about to take a wife, and he lives. Oh, let's say he lives in West Africa, just because that's what we were talking about last time. How old do you think Bill is when he gets ready to take a wife? One of the things to keep in mind is that in order for someone to get married, uh, and this is true in our culture too, you have to be able to take care of a marriage, which entails, at least in part, having obligations to a partner. And in many societies out there, um, especially cultures that have arranged marriages, no one's going to let their daughter marry a guy who isn't able to uh, care for her and provide for her. And so, again, remember, we're talking about a context where people don't set up their own new households after marriage. Do you remember that from your introduction to anthropology class? After marriage, there's lots of different ways that a new couple can start their own family. And even the way we use language to talk about that is tricky, isn't it? Because in a nuclear family setting like we have in the West, when a new couple get married, they go and they set up their own household. That's called neo-local residency. But what we see across Africa is that people in general live in extended kin groups. Now, this is obviously changing a lot in urbanization. And in the last couple of weeks of this class, we'll talk about what that looks like for families that have a component that's rural and also a component that's urban. But for today's lecture, let's talk about extended agricultural kin groups and how that makes marriage and personhood and connectedness look, at least according to a lot of these ethnographies that Riesman is summarizing. So let's imagine this guy, Bill, is about to take a wife. We've already established that no one's going to let him marry their daughter unless he's able to provide for her. So that means that for the most part, teenage males are not getting married. And even frequently, males in their 20s are not getting married. And the reason is they haven't accrued enough wealth yet. They haven't established a pattern of working yet that makes them, um, worthy, I suppose we could say, of earning this rite of passage called marriage. So for for our purposes here, and this is just a rough number, let's say that Bill, at the time he's able to take his first wife, is about 30. Now, I've known people who've taken their first partner at 25 or 35, but let's just say roundabout, this is a guy who's out of his adolescence and has established some work history. So now let's talk about what a wife might look like. A wife is going to be someone who, in general, is known to Bill's family. She probably comes from a kin group that Bill's family has a relationship with or has had a relationship with over the years. So that is to say that she's not unknown. Again, we're talking about an arranged marriage. How old do you think she is at the time of this marriage? She's going to be younger than Bill. Um, she's probably already had a significant rite of passage, and that rite of passage is going to be first menses, which means that she's menstruating, she's capable of conceiving a child. Let's also talk about like what her life has been like. She's been raised in an extended household, and she has learned to do a tremendous amount of labor. The labor of cooking, the labor of caring for livestock, the labor of caring for people, including children. She's cared for the elderly. She's learned how to grow food. She's learned how to prepare food. She's learned how to go out into the bush and select the best fuel that's going to be necessary to build a fire and keep a fire. At the time she gets married, she gets not only a husband, but she gets something very significant in a lot of African societies, and that's a hearth to cook on. She doesn't have to share another woman's hearth, like her mother's hearth or her stepmother's hearth. She has her own place to cook food. A lot of polygynous societies, one of the criteria to take a woman in marriage is to make sure that you can provide for her her own hearth and her own home, which is to say that she doesn't share her space with another woman, but rather she has that space for herself and eventually for her children. So I've said she's younger, and friends, she's sometimes a lot younger. Let's say that um, Bonnie, let's call her Bonnie, is probably about 15 at the time of marriage. So look already what we've got set up here in this marriage. We've got a really significant difference in age between a husband and a wife. Now, it could be that they're 25 and 17. It might be that they're 24 and 19. I mean, there could be a closer amount of age, but there could also be a significant amount more of difference in age. So this is a first marriage, and Bonnie's done pretty well because she's got a young husband. And so they are going to get busy with the work that marriages sanction. And that is, what we talk about in anthropology. Marriages typically sanction the births of children. So here we've got a baby and we've got a bump, and maybe we've got another baby on the way. And then we've got another baby. Oops, my babies are not doing so good. They don't look very healthy. Oh, whoops. In fact, they aren't healthy. One of the important things to remember is that in a lot of agricultural societies, um, that babies, oops, I just erased all of Bonnie's body. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Babies sometimes don't live through those really significant first years. This is one of the reasons that people cherish children so much, is because they don't necessarily have close by clinics and immunizations, and children under the age of 5 are more susceptible to disease. And so often when we have diseases rampaging around through cultures, the most vulnerable are the under fives and the olds. These are the people who usually we lose first when there's an epidemic or some kind of public health crisis. And also, there are diseases of childhood, especially things that could be waterborne, like cholera, um, sometimes things that could be born, like malaria. So um, it's one of the reasons that we see high rates of fertility in agricultural societies. I mean, one of the reasons, of course, is they want to have a lot of children because children contribute to the wealth of the household through their labor. Daughters contribute to the house of the the wealth of the household through bride wealth payments. Um, and sons contribute to the wealth of the household by taking wives and having lots more labor coming into the household. So in most African societies, the labor of female uh, participants, wives, and daughters is really highly prized. And so everybody wants Bonnie to do well in this marriage, and they want her to have healthy children. So let's imagine that Bill and Bonnie are able to have quite a few healthy children. Look at this. They're doing great. They've got daughters, oops, and they've got sons, and everybody's able to work on the family farm. I'm sorry, I am so terrible at drawing, friends. Over time, look what happens. These folks are having plenty of babies, and that's good because the community interprets this as a sign of wealth. And there's a lot of connectedness, and there's lots of people sharing a lineage, and there's lots of people available to do the kind of things like look out for one another and collect firewood and um, tell stories and create art and braid hair and do pottery and cook delicious foods. And so, time is passing and this family is aging. So let's fast forward. Let's actually go forward 15 years and look at the ages of everybody now. So now you've got Bonnie. She's the age now that she spent half of her life as a wife. And let's say that she and Bill have 5 children. They've done well. Their oldest child now, ooh, she's about 15, isn't she? Let's call her Meg. So this is an interesting situation. Bonnie and Bill have a 15-year-old daughter. They've raised her properly, they've treated her right. She knows all the rules and all the customs of this culture, and she's ready to be offered as a potential bride to someone in the community. Now, the way that the family goes about choosing a partner for Meg is very carefully. They want Meg to have the very best husband, they want her to do well. And so a lot goes into these arrangements of marriage. And as we've seen in some of the things we've read, sometimes those marriage arrangements are going all the way back to when Meg is herself an infant. And other times, people are, in other cultures, people are watching Meg and they're seeing, what's her temperament like? What kind of family might be a good fit for her? There's also this question about, is she going to go on to be a first wife? Or will she go to be someone's second wife or third wife or fifth wife or however that gets organized? And just in general, a lot of African cultures have been influenced by Islam. And we'll talk more about the history of Islam next week. In Islam, a man is eligible to take 4 wives, provided he can give them each equal accommodation. It says that in the Quran, that a man can take up to 4 wives if he's able to provide for them equally. And so most um, Muslim men, well, many Muslim men are not in the position to provide for 4 wives simultaneously. So, but some are. And so, you could take up to 4 wives. I'll have to say that when I lived in West Africa, I didn't know very many people with 4 wives. I knew a lot of people with 2, sometimes 3, but 4 wives is a lot to manage. That's a lot of people to take care of. In other parts of Africa where there's Christianity or where there really hasn't been, in Islam, people frequently take more than 4 wives if they can afford it. So Meg's getting ready to get married, and that means that there is a significant amount of wealth that's going to come into this household. We call this bride wealth. Now, bride wealth is different from dowry. You've probably heard of dowry too. Bride wealth is wealth, resources that flow from the household of the bride. No, I'm sorry, that flow from the household of the groom into the household of the bride at or around the time of marriage. So that means that Bill over here is about to get gifted some bride wealth when he betroths his beloved daughter Meg into marriage. Bride wealth varies by culture, the amount, but it's typically about, it's significant. The time when I was a Peace Corps volunteer about 30 years ago, it was the equivalent of 3 cows. So at that time, that was worth about 2,000 US dollars. So now stop and think. You're talking about subsistence agriculturalists. They don't make a lot of money. They don't have a great deal of wealth. 3 cows is a tremendous investment. That's a lot. Today, a lot of families do bride wealth in the form of cattle still. But most recently, when I've been over in Guinea, I've been talking to people about bride wealth. And bride wealth now is sometimes it's like things like vehicles or motorcycles or houses, electronics, college education money, um, or cash. So this is a resource that's coming into Bill's household at the time of his daughter's marriage. One of the things that Bill and possibly his wife, Bonnie, are interested in doing with that bride wealth is investing it in what we'll call a second wife. Well, we're not just calling it that. That's what it is, a second wife with a really jacked up skirt. um, Let's call her Bella. We know that Bill is 45. We know that Bonnie is 30. We know that they have children who are, getting ready to leave the nest. Teenage children, also probably some babies over here. Let's put another baby in here. Okay, it's a baby. How old do you think Bella is at the time that she gets married to Bill? And kind of gets married to Bonnie too, right? Bonnie's also in that marriage. Well, the age of brides actually stays pretty much the same. So now look at this. Bonnie and Bella are now co-wives, but Bonnie is really about Bella's mom's age. And that's what a household looks like in a polygynous society. It's not this like Hugh Hefner setup where there's like an older guy and then lots of like, you know, 20-year-old women. Polygynous families are processes and they take place over the course of generations, over life courses. So, you know, Bonnie is still able to bear children and be active and physical and do all of the kinds of things. She's not an old lady. Bella is younger and possibly stronger and able to do different kinds of work. And so what we see is a relationship that develops between a first and a second wife. And now sometimes this relationship is based in like mutual admiration and affection and love and well-being, because remember, everybody wants the family to do well. These people are part of an extended kin network. They're part of a lineage. They are all invested in seeing that everybody has the best case scenario. And remember, she's gone now. She's not dead, but she's not there anymore. And in the meantime, everybody's having, what is the work of being part of a community? It's about showing up for people when they're sick and showing up for people's weddings and laughing at people's jokes, even if they bug you. And, doing all those things that have to do with sharing space with others. Hey, look at this. This daughter's 15 now. So maybe a couple more years have gone by. Let's say 3 years have gone by. So we've got a situation wherein the adults of the household have aged a little, but now Bill, Bonnie, and Bella are in the market for another person to come into this household and help with the labor, help with all these babies, help with all the wealth that's starting to accrue. Because one of the things that happens, remember we were talking about relationality and wealth in people, is that when you have a lot of people in your household, you're also going to have a lot more resources to work with. Now, there's a balance here, right? Because a lot of people require a lot of resources. But what we typically find, and this is written about by a guy called Chayanov, should I write his name, is that over time, as people kind of settle into the experience, the process of relationality that takes life course, a life course kind of dimension, because all through this, right? These folks are having rites of passage. This is a big marriage when these two get married. This is a big marriage when these two get married. This is a big marriage when these two get married. And there's lots of people involved at every step. And so what you see here is the emergence of a kin group that is well able to care for itself and also to start doing the kind of thing of like um, accruing prestige or status, because maybe they're really excellent at these ladies are really excellent workers at making pottery, and the whole community really admires the pottery that they make. And so um, over time, you see that families are connected and they're all contributing to the common subsistence of their culture. This is an important piece, right? Is that everybody's buying into, oh, remember she left because she got married so that the third wife could come in. She's not dead, she just went away. So what we have here is an extended polygynous family. Now, one of the things that I want to talk about is birth order and siblinghood, because Riesman talks about this. So the children that share a mother and a father are, whole siblings, right? They're like brothers and sisters in the way that we use the term brothers and sisters. But there's also going to be half siblings living in a household. So, these kids have half siblings. They share a father with these kids, but not necessarily a mother. One of the things that we saw in the Sunjata story is that there's a different kind of relationship between whole siblings. Remember, Sunjata and his sister, who shared a mother and a father, they had this close relationship. And sometimes there are feelings of rivalry with half siblings, although not always. The other thing to remember about these households is that in these households, there's often also brothers. Bill has a brother, Bob. And while Bill's been doing this, Bob's also been doing this. Bob also has 2 or 3 wives. Bob and Bill are living together in a patrilocal community. They get married, they bring their wives in. When they want a new wife, they have to figure out a way to spend bride wealth to some other household and then bring in a new wife. And so this is this process over the course of life where people are coming into the community and people are leaving the community, but through very specific rules that are accompanied with the dispensation of resources. And sometimes kids are really good at doing stuff. And so they get sent away to school. You get to go to school. Yay, you go to the capital city and you live with your auntie who lives there. And, sometimes people um, are really not good at doing things and maybe they get cast out. You are disowned. You don't get to be part of our group anymore. People can be cursed. They can suffer misfortunes. They can be separated from the group. And, that's akin to death because it's the end of your personhood within your family. What I'm trying to create for you here with this really messy whiteboard is a sense that personhood in many African societies is a complicated, messy, life extending process. I mean, just the way it is in our culture, but it's not only based on like what you decide, because there's other people around who are making decisions for you about whom you marry, about whether or not you get to go away to school, about whether or not you get to take a wife when you are 29 or when you're 30. Because, you know, Bill's raising his bride wealth so that he could take these wives, but he's also, well, for his second and this third wife, he's basically trading out his daughters. But for that first wife, someone had to help him to accrue that bride wealth. Look, another thing that I want to say about these arranged marriages is that it's not the case that people are selling their daughters. That we tend to use that kind of metaphor in the West because we're so used to a capitalist economy where things are bought and sold. But this is really thought of more as like creating alliances and maintaining connection. Wealth in people. This is a really important concept for understanding African ethnography. And in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about the Lisa Cliggett book. And we're going to see how the wealth in people model is really important for the people who live in that community. This is the part in class where I would say, do you have any questions? And let me just stop a second and make sure I've covered everything. What I wanted you to see here is the idea about process. I wanted you to see how many people are connected and care for one another and factor into life course decisions, how rites of passage punctuate these processes, and that each one of these people has different rites of passage that are happening at different times, how relationality is both fluid but also fixed. The people that, the firstborn child is the firstborn child. And in a society that's gerontocratic, which means that the elders have more respect, birth order matters. Whether or not you're male or a female is also going to be really significant because that is how the family is going to make determinations about marriage. Hey, so let me stop right here. Um, in the United States today, we talk a lot about marriage equality. We talk about same sex marriage. We talk about non binaries. And it is true that we see evidence of all of that stuff in African contexts. Well, maybe not marriage equality, but definitely same sex marriages, definitely non binaries, definitely the idea that there's some fluidity to gender. All of that is true. But in general, the lives of people are to a large degree determined by their sex. Is that fair? Do we love that? I mean, those are important questions, and we definitely need to talk about them. In fact, Riesman talks about that a little bit in his article. The model that I've put to you here is a pronatalist model that privileges fertility in agricultural extended families in most of Africa. It is very important for a person to find a spouse with whom they can have children. Not everybody's capable of having children. And so that's another kind of set of situations that we need to address. And we've got a reading that addresses that in a couple of weeks. The last week, I think. It's particularly hard on women who can't have children. But the long and the short of it here with this diagram that I've tried to create for you is that the prospect of being part of a family is a key marker of personhood. I think most Africans that I know, most Africans that I've read about would have a very hard time understanding how you could be a person without having kin. It's so central to the idea of being and of belonging and of connectedness. So I've mentioned here in this diagram, to return to the Riesman article, he really has 5 concepts that I want to try to work with you here. The first one, like I said, is this idea of birth order, polygyny, what that kind of a family looks like, because it looks very different from what we have in the West. I also want to talk a little bit about this topic that he introduces called gender antagonism. I also want to talk about patron-client, or sometimes we can also talk about joking relations. And then I want to talk a little bit about the idea of supernatural and ritual that he talks about through this article. And then finally, I want to talk about the idea of self-control, or what we sometimes, what Victor Uchenda talks about as transparency. Victor Uchendu is a Nigerian anthropologist. So I've already mentioned a lot about this birth order polygyny stuff, and this is it's the idea of personhood that happens within the household. We also learn that in a lot of African societies, because there is such a strict uh, awareness of sex, that the result of that is that men do men work and women do women's work. And you can imagine that men and women's work is not always valued the same way. Frequently, men's work is valued more highly. Uh, Sharon Hutchinson, who's an anthropologist who worked among the newer, talks about the ways that men, because they are patrilineal, because men grow up with their brothers and their cousins through their father's lineage, so their father's brothers, sons, their first cousins, whom they will frequently use the term brother to reference. Hey, this was so hard for me when I was in Mali and I was trying to understand how people were related. I'd be talking to people and they would say my brother, and then they would also say my brother, and then they'd be referring to somebody else and they would be like, oh yeah, did you meet my brother? And I was kind of losing my mind because I was like, how are all these people your brother? It's because the kin term brother is used to refer to anyone who's of the same age set and the same patrilineal system. So you're talking here about, what we would consider brothers, same mother, same father, and also what we would call half brothers. So same father, but different mother, half siblings. And also first cousins related through the father. So that is a huge number of people sometimes. And, it's not uncommon to meet someone and have them talk about their family and use these kin terms in a way that makes sense for this kind of a system, but doesn't make sense in our language. So that's the piece of not only being an anthropologist, but just being like a person who pays attention to other people's families. I have to, start picking apart and understanding what specifically are they meaning. But men and women are raised with very different expectations about what kind of person they're supposed to be. And sometimes those expectations are so significant that they can create tensions. Men work typically communally, they work together. And you often have women entering villages as brides. And, we've said here before that a lot of times African societies don't think specifically about being individuals, but we can argue that young women have that experience of marriage, how frightening that must be. Even though they probably know the people that they're going to go live with, they've probably been there before. It still must be scary to leave your parents and go somewhere else. Hutchinson says that in newer society, this creates gender antagonism, a kind of a conflict between males and females. And we do see gender antagonism happening in a number of African societies. It's mostly written about in pastoralist societies, so places where people raise livestock, where we see the difference in labor between men and women being very, very highlighted. In agricultural societies, maybe not so much distinction between the work that men and women do. Uh, Although I will say that sometimes the space of the community is marked by gender, so that there's places where men hang out. We call those homosocial spaces, places where really only men are allowed to go or congregate. And then there can also be places where men are discouraged from going. And a lot of times these are places that have to do with like water, or places that have to do with like sacred orchards, or particular places in the landscape that are thought to be um, very fertile, like for women. Um, Victor Turner writes about this when he writes about the Ndumbu tree. Another kind of relationality that Riesman talks about throughout this article is the idea of joking relations or patron-client relations. So remember, communities are made up of different lineages, different people, different last names, all tracing their descent back to some men. And the men at some point in the past were probably related too. But frequently what you'll find is that different lineages develop over time, especially if they have occupational specializations. Like one group of people is doing like blacksmithing, and another group of people is doing like, I don't know, making pottery. And those two people, those two lineages over time develop a kind of a familiarity. So this is something that Riesman talks about in his article. There's a real distinction between when you act very formal with someone, and a lot of relationships in African societies are characterized by formality. It would be very rude to make certain kinds of assumptions about people, or to be too familiar with someone, to call someone by their family given name. One place where we see a lot of formality is between the generations. Uh, Many African societies tend to be very formal between parents and children. Like that relationship is marked by formality. But then there's also relationships that are marked by informality, where you can maybe make crude jokes or dress a little bit differently or be a little bit more relaxed. And a lot of times we see that between children and grandchildren, this lack of formality. The same thing happens with different kinds of lineages. Some lineages are going to be eligible marriage partners because of the way that arranged marriages work, because of the ways that the rules of endogamy and exogamy work. Do you remember from your Anthropology 100 class? Endogamy means a group of people within which you must marry. So typically endogamy has to do with like your ethnic group or sometimes your religion. Your parents are going to want to arrange a marriage to somebody who's within that field. You don't want to arrange a marriage with somebody who's, doesn't have the same culture as you. So we're endogamous typically to our language, our faith, our ethnicity. And granted, this has changed radically and will continue to change, and has changed in Africa, of course, too. But again, remember, we're talking about traditionally. Exogamy is a group that you must marry outside of. So we always marry outside of our lineage. Because if you didn't, that would be incest, wouldn't it? You can't marry somebody that you're related to. But sometimes the way that these cultures determine endogamy and exogamy is you must marry outside of your father's lineage, but sometimes it's preferred that you marry someone inside of your mother's lineage. So it is possible to marry a first cousin, but that would be a first cousin on your mother's side. And that's going to be a group of people that, if your parents are married, then that means that there's already a kind of a relationship between these two lineages. And so it makes sense that in the next generation, they might want to continue that relationality. So we see this among the Bambara. We see this among different groups of people in Senegal. That there's a formality and an informality that has to do with the way that people are assuming patron-client relations. One lineage has more status than the other lineage, or one lineage is eligible marriage partners to another lineage. And if you're eligible marriage partners, you're going to have to be formal because you don't want to be overly informal and offend your future mother-in-law. So, this set of relationality that Riesman is talking about in the article isn't in every African society, but we do see it in many African societies. He also talks in here about personhood and how that is sometimes experienced in like a supernatural sense. This is the idea of a soul, the idea that there's something innate in us that maybe came from the afterlife, like when we were born into this world, we were already a soul that had lived here before, and that also after we pass from this world, that there's a part of us that will continue. Sometimes we hear people talking about ghosts. Um, Another really sort of common thing that happens is the phenomenon of possession. So the idea that there is a soul somewhere that has some kind of message or restlessness and that it can possess a person. Now, the person that it possesses is typically someone who's a religious practitioner. So it's going to be like a shaman or someone who already has some kind of familiarity with dealing with the supernatural. But sometimes that possession is going to happen in a ritual sense. And so, if you see people dancing with masks, a lot of times they are taking on this kind of energy of possession while they're dancing. Um, Another thing that can happen that's supernaturally is like cursing someone, or if someone falls ill, the solution, the way that many African societies experience illness or sickness is that it must have been caused by some kind of curse or witchcraft or misfortune that isn't about germs or about your immune system, but rather is about something actively attacking. And so there can be rituals and techniques that people use to protect themselves in a supernatural or a spiritual way. And we'll talk more about this next week when we talk about religion and faith. And then this final category that Riesman is talking us through is this idea about, like, what is it to be a person? And not only what is it to be a person, but what is it to be a good person? That there's often this balance that has to happen between self-control and also, kind of for informality. This way that you have a kind of a way of correctness that you comport yourself, and that's taught to you. And then there's also a place or a kind of a sphere where you can relax a little bit. And again, I would direct you to the work of Uchendu in Nigeria. He writes a good deal about this, but he calls this concept transparency. But lots of other ethnographers write about the ways in which African people, African persons, think about personal autonomy, right? So I've said at the very beginning, in the West, we grow up thinking about ourselves as individuals. And that's not to say that Africans don't have an idea of who they are as individuals. I mean, of course they do. But that the way that they make decisions and that the way that they interact with people is constructed quite differently. And so Western ethnographers are really interested in trying to get at the, like how do they think? There's a Zulu writer, South African writer who's Zulu, whose name is Jordan Kusu Ngumbene. Oh, write his name down. And he writes about, and I'll leave you with this idea today, this idea that as we as persons navigate our world, on any given day, we make decisions, we make choices, we interact with people in particular ways, and we create tracks through our world. Now, some of those tracks you can erase and you can start over, but other tracks are permanent. And so when you make a mistake, sometimes those things are permanent. Or when you make a friendship, sometimes those things are permanent. Or when you disgrace yourself, sometimes those things are permanent. And that the challenge of life is finding a track and wandering through it in a way that you have your own self-respect, but you also have humility, and that you have the capacity to be creative and make choices for yourself, but you also have the ability to maintain relationality with other people. And so, for all of us as persons navigating this track, it's tricky. The rules for navigating here in the United States and Springfield are probably quite a lot different than the rules for all these people that Riesman is talking about in this article. And even within this article, the rules differ for the different people that he's talking about. And you can see, I mean, he's very comprehensive. He's talking about the Fang, he's talking about the Dogon, he's talking about the Newer, he's talking about the Ituri. He's like, he is all over the continent. And what he's trying to do is give us this very rich picture about what it is to be a person and how tricky it is to study cultures of persons. And that's what anthropology is. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude this lecture. And the next lecture, lecture 9, is going to be about Lisa Cliggett's book, Grains from Grass. And then you've got lecture 10, that's about Willis and gerontocracy. And I think lecture 11, which is about Bettleman and the Kaguru house, is that right? That should be up too. So a lot of stuff this week, mostly talking about social organization, how people in African cultures organize themselves relative to each other. And then next week, we'll talk about magic and witchcraft. So hit me up if you have questions. And to those of you who weren't able to hear my previous lecture, sorry about that. Hopefully this one's better. Bye.